A main focus of global women's studies is to raise awareness on the mistreatment of women throughout the world in order to put an end to it. Today, our speaker, Dr. Rex Nielsen, will be doing just that. Dr. Nielsen is a professor of Spanish and Portuguese here at BYU. Specifically, he teaches classes on Portuguese language, literature, and culture, and the history of Brazil, Portugal, and Africa. Occasionally, Dr. Nielsen teaches classes on women's rights of the Americas and masculinity and feminism in the Global Women's Studies Department. Dr. Nielsen has received his undergraduate degree in comparative literature and Portuguese from BYU. He has 2 master's degrees, one in comparative literature from BYU and another in Portuguese and Brazilian studies from Brown University. During his time at Brown University, Dr. Nielsen also earned a PhD in Portuguese and Brazilian studies. Currently, in his personal research, Dr. Nielsen is looking at the ways in which feminism created masculinity, as well as how men contribute to gender oppression and can help end it. Last year, he edited the special volume on masculinity in Portuguese. Dr. Nielsen has recently published a variety of articles on gender and women, masculinity, and women's issues. Dr. Nielsen has dedicated his career to helping identify and solve gender issues in Spanish and Portuguese countries, and for that, we as women thank him. We are so excited to have Dr. Nielsen with us today to present on the lives of 2 amazing Brazilian women who dedicated their lives to fighting for women's rights and have changed the world. We know you'll enjoy this presentation on Marielle Franco, Maria de Penha, and women's rights in Brazil. Please give a warm welcome to Dr. Nielsen.
Thank you so much. It truly is a pleasure and honor to speak to you today as part of the BYU Global Women's Studies program. Colloquial lecture series. I don't know if that's the official long title, but it really is a pleasure. My presentation today is an outgrowth of my research on representations of gender in Brazilian literature, specifically the values associated with masculinity in Brazilian culture and the relationship between fathers, family models, and how the nation imagines itself. I know that in invoking the concept of masculinity, this may seem unusual for a women's studies colloquium, but I know that this semester you've heard already from my colleague Kevin Schaefer from sociology, who talked about fathers and fatherhood. And I would also like to give, a justification and explanation for this. While I will discuss masculinity, and specifically Brazilian masculinity as part of this presentation, my purpose in doing so is to help provide a context for understanding issues that lie at the core of a variety of feminist projects in Brazil. The scholar Judith Keegan Gardner has bluntly observed, quote, "Misogyny created feminist theory, and feminist theory has helped create masculinity," unquote. In other words, one of my goals today is to elucidate for you the relationship between masculinity studies and feminism, for I believe that if we are committed to understanding women's issues and promoting women's rights and gender equality, whether in our society or in Brazil or any other place, we must simultaneously understand masculinity better. I believe that at least one part of the answer to achieving greater gender equality is helping men understand the role they play in this movement, and accordingly, a significant part of my research during the last 10 years has focused on masculinity and the representation of men in Brazilian literature. But just as much as this presentation is an outgrowth of my research, it is also tied to 2 extraordinarily important current events from Brazil. One is the ratification in 2006 of a law number 11.340, known as the Maria da Penha Law on Domestic and Family Violence, a law that was the culmination of a decades-long fight for women's rights and the protections of victims of domestic and family violence. This law has dramatically impacted the condition of women in Brazil for the better. The other event occurred on March 14th, 2018, 1 year ago today, a day in which an outspoken city councilor in Rio de Janeiro was murdered in a carefully orchestrated, cold-blooded assassination. This tragedy and the responses to it, manifested in the media and by politicians, unfortunately highlight the work yet to be accomplished in achieving gender equality in Brazil. To help you understand these 2 events, I will first provide some historical context by sketching in brief terms the history of women's rights in Brazil. I'll begin in the 19th century, at the time of Brazil's independence. Then I'll discuss a series of political achievements related to women's rights during the 20th century. and some laws associated with those achievements, before returning to the Maria da Penha law and the murder of Marielle Franco. So first, some historical context. As I go over these historical antecedents, you will no doubt identify a number of events and concerns that align with what is frequently referred to as first wave, second wave, and third wave feminism here in the United States. This slide here shows a series of events that are important for the development of women's rights in Brazil. First, 1822, the independence of Brazil. Brazil achieved its political independence from Portugal in 1822. This independence movement was radically different than occurred in other American states. Namely, Brazil did not wage a war to achieve independence. In 1806, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded the Iberian Peninsula, and so the royal family of Portugal, along with the entire court and nearly the entire aristocratic class, approximately 15,000 people, left Portugal and fled to Brazil. Once the threat of Napoleon was gone, many in the aristocracy returned to Lisbon, but some members of the royal family stayed in Brazil. The Portuguese king, Dom João VI, returned to Lisbon, but he anticipated that the colony of Brazil would follow the pattern of other European colonies in the Americas and desire independence, and so he left his son and instructed him to essentially lead the independence movement. In doing so, the leadership of the country could stay in the family, so to speak. So this happened. Brazil declared itself independent in 1822, but it did not form a republic. Independence established a monarchy and declared Brazil an empire. The Empire of Brazil. This is important because a tension arose in Brazil during the 19th century between some of the revolutionary ideals that characterized the American Revolution and the French Revolution, but these ideals were increasingly at odds with the monarchy government of Brazil. In other words, Brazil achieved independence, but in general terms, this happened without a revolution. The status quo remained in effect in political and social terms. In 1827, we have what is considered to be the first achievement for women in Brazil, with an imperial law that allowed girls permission to attend high school beyond primary school. This happened through an imperial decree. In 1832, this year, an important publication was circulated called Direitos das Mulheres e Injustiças dos Homens, which means the rights of women and injustices of men. Written and published by Nízia Floresta, and I have here an image of her. This pamphlet is considered to be the foundation of Brazilian feminism. In this work, Floresta reinforces the idea that a woman is just as capable as a man in taking on responsibilities of leadership and any other function. The text was modeled on an important French text. I'm going to butcher the French here, Déclaration des droits de la femme et des citoyennes. So the Declaration of the Rights of Women and the Citizen, a legal treatise published in 1791 by Olympe de Gouges, which was itself modeled on the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, a central document published in 1789. Following this French model, Nízia Floresta was the first woman in Brazil to denounce the myth of male superiority in public, besides the first to publicly characterize women as intelligent beings worthy of respect. In 1852, so moving on, let's see, here's an image of that text. In 1852, the first known periodical dedicated to women's issues began to be published. It's called Jornal das Senhoras, or the Ladies' Newspaper. This paper published a variety of articles affirming that women should not just learn piano, needlework, and sewing, but take an interest in a variety of social and political activities. After this, other journals appeared, like Belo Sexo, The Beautiful Sex, in 1862, Sexo Feminino, The Feminine Sex, in 1873, and others. Let's see here. Okay, so I just want to go back. A couple other things. 1871, a very important law is ratified. It's called the Law of the Free Womb, a Lei do Ventre Livre. This law was signed by Princess Isabel and determined that the children of enslaved women would be born free. The abolition of slavery only occurred in 1888 with the Golden Law, the Lei Áurea, making Brazil the last nation of the Americas to abolish slavery. But it's significant that this law was signed, decreed by the Princess Isabel, who was beginning to assert herself into Brazilian politics. 1879, another important date. Women are granted permission, again by law, to be able to be admitted into universities in Brazil. Despite the legality of doing so, many women still faced prejudice and discrimination as they enrolled in universities. Let me point out a couple other dates here. Chiquinha Gonzaga, the first woman conductor in Brazil, a musician and composer. She frequently challenged the machista or misogynistic codes governing behavior of women and men in society. She even separated from her husband, and who had tried to make her give up music. She became one of Brazil's most important musical innovators during the late 19th century. 8 years later, we have 1887, Rita Lobato Freitas received the first medical degree from a Brazilian institution. She graduated from the College of Medicine in the Bahia and is generally considered to be the second woman from Brazil to receive a medical degree. There was one woman before her who received a degree in the United States. Rita suffered various forms of discrimination from individuals who believed that women studying at the university was a form of rebellion. Perhaps unsurprisingly, her medical dissertation produced at the end of her program was focused on women's issues, namely cesarean operations, and she became an obstetrician. The year 1888, another very important year, notable for the declaration ending slavery in Brazil on May 13th. This law, let's see, oh yeah, there's Rita. So here's 1888, the Lei Áurea on May 13th. This law was signed by the Princess Isabel, the first Brazilian female senator and the first woman to lead a country in the Americas. Some other important dates. 1918, Maria Lacerda Moura. She published an important book called Em Torno da Educação, so surrounding education. This book regularly appears on lists of the most important books associated with Brazilian feminism. In it, Maria Lacerda argues in favor of female liberation through education and insists that education is an indispensable factor in the lives of women. Here's another quote that I found by her. A mulher operária é ainda mais sacrificada, escrava do homem, escrava social e serva da burguesia. The working woman is sacrificed in yet another way, a slave of man, a social slave, and a servant of the bourgeoisie. Some other interesting events. Oh yeah, I skipped this one. 1921. You know Brazil loves soccer. In 1921, the first women's soccer game is held. The game featured two teams from neighborhoods of Tremembé and Cantareira, both from the north side of São Paulo. The game was commented on by newspapers at the time, which called it curious and comical, revealing a journalistic sexism of the day. Women's soccer events regularly appeared in circuses in Brazil at this time as a sideshow, if you will. The first semi-professional team was organized in 1958 with the name Araguari Atlético Clube in Minas Gerais. So, coming back, let's see here. Some other important events. 1923, the Ana Neri School of Nursing was founded. She was a pioneer of nursing in Brazil. 1928, the first female mayor is elected in Brazil. Alzira Soriano de Souza was elected the mayor of Fortaleza at a time when women did not yet have the vote. Other notable political firsts include Yolanda Fleming, the first governor of a state, the state of Acre, way in the north. Luísa Erundina, the first woman to become the mayor of São Paulo. Dilma Rousseff, most recently, the first female president of Brazil. In 1932, there's actually two dates for women gaining the right to vote, 1932 and 1934. In 1932, some women received the vote, and only in 1934 was the right to vote extended to all women of all income levels, regardless of social status or civil status. 2 years previously, in 1932, single women and widows who had their own income and married women who had the permission of their husbands could vote. A woman named Berta Lutz is the name of the woman who was primarily responsible for organizing the suffragist movement in Brazil and the political actions that resulted in the right to vote. She was eventually elected to Brazil's Congress and fought for greater equality and political rights for women. And just by comparison, here are the dates of the suffrage dates in other countries of when various countries gave women the right to vote. So some other things. 1936, the first union just for women. It was a union of domestic workers, in other words, a union for maids. 1962, a very important law gets passed, Law 4.212. This law is called the Statute of Married Women. It was passed allowing married women to work without providing written authorization from their husbands. In other words, prior to 1962, all married women required written authorization from their husbands in order to be legally hired and to receive a salary. This law also granted married women rights to inheritance and the chance to request custody of children in cases of separation. 1962 is also the year in which contraceptive medicine arrived in Brazil. So 1975, an important publication begins. It's called Brasil Mulher, or Brazil Woman. It was a periodical that elicited notable irritation from men, especially other journalists and politicians. Its opening editorial, here's the cover of one of the first issues. The opening editorial noted, and I quote, "Brazil Woman is not the newspaper of the woman. Its goal is to be a voice in the quest and in reclaiming of lost equality. This work is directed towards men and women. We do not desire to base ourselves on biological differences in order to benefit from small male favors. At the same time that the state, formed by men, gives us just one place compared to what has been determined by an incapacity to participate based on mental weakness." Unquote. The periodical was short-lived due to financial struggles, lasting only 2 years with 20 editions. But again, it is considered to be one of the foundational voices of what we would call second-wave feminism in Brazil. Moving along, in 1977, Law 6.515, legalizing divorce, was approved on the 26th of December. I just want to point out how late this is in comparison to other countries. It's very late. The passing of this law initiated an important national debate on separation in marriages. This is important because prior to this point, separated women were frequently looked at askance, suffering various forms of social stigma, especially by other women who preferred to remain in unhappy and abusive marriages rather than ask for separation. And in fact, even after the law was approved, negative stigma remained attached to divorced women. To this day, it is considered to be feia, or ugly, when a woman divorces. But divorced men often do not suffer the same social stigma. So just a few other dates of note for us. In 1980, the armed forces begin to accept women, first in the Air Force and then later in the Army. In 1985, the first police unit, delegacia means it's like a police force dedicated to women, is established. It was called the Police for Specialized Services for Women. It was established in São Paulo. And their purposes were essentially to investigate crimes of domestic and sexual violence committed against women. In 1996, a quota system was passed by the National Congress requiring political parties to register at least 20% of all their candidates to be women. In other words, for a party had to have at least 20% of anyone standing for office had to be a woman. And then finally in 2001, the Brazilian Civil Code was fully replaced. We don't have a similar combination of laws in the United States as they do in Brazil, that's called the Civil Code. But the Civil Code is an extensive body of laws governing all forms of social and civil behaviors. This code was long outmoded and needing to be replaced. And in fact, the procedures to replace the Civil Code of 1916 began in 1975, and so it took 26 years for the Civil Code to be replaced. The new Civil Code effective January 11th, 2003, so it was passed in 2001, became effective in 2003, updates numerous legal provisions concerning family, property, estate, and contract law. Whereas the old code endorsed male authority in the home, the new code notably revises old laws regulating gender relations in order to promote women's rights, and it modifies concepts of marriage and family to protect the rights of women and children. For the first time, the code employs gender-neutral terminology. For example, it uses the word pessoa, person, rather than homem, man. The legal definition of marriage has been changed to treat husband and wife as equal partners. Likewise, the terms governing divorce, which again was only legalized at the very end of 1977, essentially in 1978, have been altered to guarantee equal rights regarding custody of children and the division of property. Similarly, and I know this may be hard to believe, but prior to 2001, it was legal for a man to request marriage annulment if he discovered that his wife was not a virgin. A lack of virginity was considered to be a crime and was a just cause for seeking a divorce. Before 2001, even if a divorced woman had guardianship or custody of her children, the father still legally retained authority over major decisions made in behalf of the children, such as which schools they would attend. Now mother and father are given equal authority in decision-making. Other notable revisions in the 2001 in the Civil Code include eliminating the use of the expressions legitimate and illegitimate on birth certificates. Again, this is up until 2001. And restricting blood relatives to those persons only 4 levels away, whereas before 6 levels were included as blood relations. The new code makes numerous other provisions to promote equality for inheritance rights, the age of emancipation, adoption, among other family-related topics. In sum, these changes effectively end the father's unilateral legal power. Yet in spite of the many advances achieved in the new Civil Code, some have criticized the law for not being progressive enough in protecting individual rights. For example, Timothy Power and Mala Hetung speak of a lingering conservatism in Brazilian law in their excellent study evaluating the new Civil Code. Others have questioned why it took so long for these changes to be made at all, since it should not be forgotten that initial modifications to the code were officially proposed by Miguel Real in 1975. The debate in the Congress leading up to the code's revisions in 2001 sparked a flurry of heated arguments in the wider news media that revealed deep-seated moral attitudes and prompted the sociologists Gisálio Cerqueira Filho and Gislene Neder to ask, and I quote, "To what extent is the delay in approving the Civil Code a symptom of the permanence of a political and legal culture powerfully entrenched in Thomistic, meaning Catholic, and absolutist notions of power, hierarchy, and obedience," unquote. Just as Power and Hetung speak of lingering conservatism, Cerqueira Filho and Neder note the permanence of a political culture rooted in absolute notions of power, hierarchy, and obedience. Cerqueira Filho and Neder propose that resistance to the ratification of the new Civil Code must be understood as a function of underlying historical conditions. And they go even further by arguing that many of the social problems facing Brazil today, including child prostitution, sexual abuse, rape, and domestic violence, cannot be resolved without a clear understanding of the country's historical and cultural context. I'm going to skip some historical background. There's lots of historical background to go into. But in the interest of time, because I want to get to some other important things, I'll just point out this was a piece of political propaganda produced in the late 1930s by Getúlio Vargas, who was the dictator of Brazil at the time. He was known as the Pai dos Pobres, the father of the poor. He presented himself as a father figure. Almost all of his political posters feature an image very similar to this, where he is a father with children. And here is the motto listed here. It says, "Children, by learning at home and at school to worship your country, you will bring into your practical life all the probabilities of success. Only love builds, and necessarily loving Brazil will lead you to the highest destinies among the nations. And you will achieve the greatest desires nurtured in each Brazilian heart. So this is a fantastic political piece here. In hindsight, if you are familiar with Brazil's history and Vargas's transition from elected president to authoritarian dictator, it seems almost inevitable. For families, as even my mother has noted, are by nature not democratic. In the same vein, the military dictatorship that came to power in 1964, a decade after Vargas, not only appropriated patriarchal power through its own violent seizure of government, but it grossly abused this authority to legitimize itself and justify its treatment of dissidents. Those who resisted the dictatorship were at best cast as prodigals, ungrateful children in need of a firm and guiding hand, or worse, they were denied membership or parentage in the family altogether, the result of a complete identification between the family and the state. The rights of individuals as citizens were stripped, and these individuals experienced the worst that the society can offer: injustice, torture, and exile. Here is a motto of the military dictatorship during the 1960s and 70s. It says, "Ame o Brasil ou deixe-o." Love Brazil or leave it. Either you support the dictatorship or you should leave. That this form of rule was not abandoned after Vargas, but it rather extended during the military dictatorship, reveals the depth to which this form of paternal metaphors have taken root in Brazilian culture. What is significant about the culture of patriarchy during the early 20th century and culminating with the military dictatorship is the strict and singular vision this patriarchy assumed. Dissent and resistance by those who did not easily replicate and fall in line with the family image were met with intolerance, suspicion, and misunderstanding. As Sergio Buarque de Holanda elaborates, the hierarchy and morality of family relationships, relationships based on favor rather than rights, on hierarchy and subordination rather than equality, have deeply infused Brazilian culture, and the government itself has at times adopted a familial precision where the relation abides no argument, no questions or quarrels. So this brings us to today. I just wanted to review some statistics for you. I apologize that these slides are in Portuguese, but I'll describe them in general terms. The data here is coming from a study by the National Institute for Geography and Statistics in Brazil. And this data is about within the last 10 years. Here we have salary difference for women and men, controlling for other factors such as race and social status. And you can see that difference, men on the right, women on the left. Here's another one, a salary difference by specific field of profession. You can see that in all fields, men make more than women in Brazil. The only one where it's almost close is by interns. Interns almost make the same if you're men and women, but men still have an advantage. Here is level of school. You can see for the age of 12 and older on the far right that men have higher the levels of schooling. This is controlling for the same level of schooling. Men make much more than the women controlling for. This is how many years of schooling they've had here on the right. This is work week and the kind of how much time men and women spend in the office. So you can see that men typically spend more time in the office than women. You can see at home, women bear a greater burden of domestic labor than men do. The only one I wanted to point out here is in the bottom left. It's the representation of women in political office. So only 10% of elected politicians are women, despite the law that says that 20% of women of every party have to stand for office. Let's see. And then here are some attitudes about violence towards women. And if you'd like, I'll send these to Valerie or the TA for the class, and you can have these later. This is a map of violence towards women in Brazil, and it's the homicide rate, the femicide rate for women per 100,000 inhabitants. You can see that there are some states where it is definitely more dangerous to be a woman than other states. So again, let me return now to Marielle da Penha, the woman whose name has been given to the law 11.340. In 1976, and these are some pictures of Marielle da Penha when she was young, Marielle da Penha was a student studying to become a biopharmacist in São Paulo when she met a man, Marcos Antonio Heredia Viveiros, a school teacher originally from Colombia. They met through mutual friends. Marcos was likable, charming. They fell in love, and they were married. After Maria finished her studies, the couple moved across the country to her home city of Fortaleza, located on the northeastern coast of the country. They formed a family and had 3 children, all daughters. But the relationship became strained, and Marcos became violent. When the children were little, and while Maria was out of the home, he began to physically abuse the girls, aged 7, 5, and 2 at the time. He would hit them, tie them up, force them to sit in the shower in cold water. And as the violence continued, Maria felt trapped and isolated and alone. Then one night in May 1983, Maria was home asleep when her husband shot her 2 times. One of the bullets lodged in her spine, and she was left a paraplegic. Neighbors heard the noise and called the police, but Maria's husband told them that he had been woken by a noise and had encountered 4 strangers in the house. After a struggle, he said they had tied him up and had shot Maria. The police believed him, and since Maria had been immediately rushed to the hospital, Maria's version of events would not be heard until much later. No one was arrested. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1980s, apart from a single specialized police force in São Paulo, similar units were rare in Brazil, and the police generally was not trained to handle domestic abuse. Additionally, police lacked specific legal powers to act in response to domestic violence. There was no such thing as a restraining order at that time. Furthermore, even in the 1980s, a man who murdered his wife, if she had been unfaithful, he could claim a defense of dishonor, and murder charges could be reduced or dismissed. Maria stayed in the hospital for 4 months, but once she returned home, the abuse continued. Her husband tried to control her visitors and would prevent any neighbors, friends, or family to visit without his consent. Maria felt as though she was under house arrest, and so she began to look for a way out. Without her husband's knowledge, she tried to secure a court order giving her custody of the children so that she could flee the house. But you should think about how difficult this would be for a paraplegic who's confined to her home. And I should note that Brazil, even today, has strict laws governing the ability to travel without children. Even today, a parent cannot board a bus or airplane and cross state lines without a notarized document signed by the other parent giving permission for the travel. Unfortunately, before she was able to get this document, her husband attempted to kill her a second time, this time by tampering with the electrical shower while she was bathing. Miraculously, she survived the electrocution attempt, and this time she left her husband for good. Marielle da Penha sought legal protection against her husband, but the court case dragged on for nearly 2 decades. All the while, her husband remained free. Maria's frustration with the Brazilian legal system grew with each legal setback, and she eventually took her case to an international court of human rights, which, in a landmark ruling, criticized the Brazilian government for not taking effective measures to prosecute and convict perpetrators of domestic violence. In response, in 2006, the Brazilian government enacted a law under the symbolic name of Marielle da Penha, the Marielle da Penha Law on Domestic and Family Violence. Since 2006, the law has resulted in literally hundreds of thousands of prosecutions and judgments. The law establishes special courts and stricter penalties for offenders, but also provides other instruments for the prevention of domestic abuse and relief in cities designated large cities of more than 60,000 inhabitants, such as police stations and shelters for women. If you're interested in learning more about Marielle da Penha, I recommend you Google the Maria da Penha Institute. I put the address right there, as well as the website quebreuciclo.com.br, break the cycle. This long overdue law represents a major step forward in protecting women's rights in Brazil. But unfortunately, Maria da Penha herself, now in her late 70s, notes that much work remains to be done. So now, I'd like to speak about Marielle Franco, an even more recent case. Marielle described herself as a feminist, black, and member of the community of Maré, an economically disadvantaged area of the north side of the city of Rio de Janeiro. Marielle was equally passionate about promoting these three aspects of her identity. She graduated from college in sociology and began a political career working as an aide to a state legislator, Marcelo Freixo, where she worked for nearly 10 years until 2016, when she was elected to the City Council of Rio de Janeiro, a major accomplishment for a city with a population of 6.5 million people. In her position on the City Council, she quickly gained notoriety for speaking out on issues related to feminism, race relations, and economic disparity in the city. She was a human rights activist and strongly denounced police violence, although she also provided assistance to the families of police officers killed in the line of duty in Rio. In turn, she was also frequently the subject of critical attacks based on her gender, her sexual orientation, Marielle defined as bisexual, her race, and her humble origins. Her political activism earned her many powerful enemies. She was murdered on March 14, 2018, on her way home from a political debate with other black female politicians. Despite the high index of violence in the country, Marielle's murder shocked the nation, especially as it became clear that her murder was a deliberate, well-orchestrated assassination. But the initial shock turned to anger as the days, weeks, and months passed with no arrests made and seemingly no justice in sight. Calls for justice have come from groups and individuals throughout Brazil, but also from the international community. For example, one letter dated March 22, 2018 was signed by a variety of public figures in the United States, including Angela Davis, Arundhati Roy, Edward Snowden, Glenn Greenwald, Black Lives Matter co-founders Patrisse Cullors and Opal Tometi, Naomi Campbell, and Noam Chomsky, among others. The international attention even led Pope Francis to call Marielle's mother, Marinete da Silva, to express his condolences. Over the past year, this unsolved murder has come to symbolize the injustices of Brazil's social and political situation. In a country where those from the periphery, those who come from economically impoverished areas, and those who are black face discrimination and disadvantage in nearly every aspect of contemporary life, Marielle's unsolved murder has symbolized this disadvantage. Some have questioned, why has there been a seeming inability on the part of the police to investigate and solve this murder? Was it because she was a woman? Because she was black? Because she was from a favela, a low-income neighborhood? It is true that the factors of gender, race, and social status are revealed in Marielle's murder, showing the complexity of achieving gender and racial equality in the country. Marches have been organized, and street art featuring portraits of Marielle have appeared all across the city and even abroad. I wanted to show you a few of these. These two images are not from Brazil. On the left, we have an image by a man named Alessi Bolognesi in Ferrara, Italy. I like this image in particular. It's an image based on a famous photograph of Marielle that circulated, in which she's showing her shoulder and the phrase "não é não," which is an important hashtag referencing sexual harassment during Carnival. It literally means no, no and no. That's from Italy. This one on the right by a Portuguese street artist named Vils in Portugal. Here are a couple others. They're painting the phrase Marielle presente, which means Marielle is present. Another important hashtag that, again, has circulated to help remind us of Marielle and keep her in the news. Here's another one. It says, Luci como Marielle Franco, fight like Marielle Franco. And then there's this one. Last year, Nobel laureate Malala Yousafzai visited Rio de Janeiro to speak, and during part of her visit, she visited one of the street murals of Marielle and helped to add her own image next to Marielle in a sign of solidarity. I threw this one up there because about a week later, this particular portrait was vandalized, as you can see on the left. The image has since been restored by the graffiti artist Pamela Castro, but it is sadly not the only instance of acts of vandalism towards these images of Marielle. In the months leading up to the one-year anniversary of Marielle's death, a number of events in Brazil and internationally, including this lecture here at BYU, were planned to commemorate Marielle's life and bring attention to this unsolved murder. Last week, during the Carnival celebrations in Rio de Janeiro, the Mangueira Samba School unveiled an enormous flag featuring Marielle's face. I anticipated that today I would speak about the need to solve Marielle's murder and to bring justice to her and her family, both for personal reasons but also for its symbolic value. Nonetheless, 2 days ago, authorities in Brazil announced the arrests of 2 individuals who have been charged with Marielle's murder. The gunman, according to police, was a former police officer who was angered by Marielle's outspoken critiques of police violence. His accomplice and driver was also a former police officer. In a strange and disturbing turn, the gunman apparently lived in an upscale condominium in the same building as where the now current and polarizing president of Brazil, Jair Bolsonaro, was previously living. This image was taken today. There are a number of events happening all across Brazil to commemorate Marielle. The case of Marielle's murder is still unfolding. I'm sure we will yet learn other interesting and enlightening facts about her tragic murder and the motives and circumstances of her death. But I wish to conclude on a hopeful note. Maria da Penha's struggle for justice was delayed and took a circuitous route, but it ultimately culminated in a landmark law that has brought increased protection to women in Brazil and raised the profile of women's rights throughout the country. Marielle's tragic murder has similarly galvanized political efforts to bring justice to those who are marginalized on account of their gender, sexual orientation, race, and economic status. Perhaps the best way we can honor Marielle's life today is by standing up for those who have been discriminated against, defending them, respecting them, and acknowledging their place and value in our society. Thank you for your attention. Where do I go?
You can sit down for a minute.
Okay.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Nielsen. Many of us may never visit or live in Brazil, but it is essential that we are aware of the issues Brazilian women face so that we may be the voice for those who cannot speak for themselves. Our most powerful forms of progress occur when we seek to be educated on these worldwide problems and apply pressure to the government by bringing international attention to the injustices they experience. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For this reason, we are so grateful that we have had the opportunity to learn more about these women and their stories. Despite the progress that the Maria da Penha law represents, there are still obstacles to it being fully implemented amongst law enforcement and placed as a priority by the government. Marielle Franco's murder is just one example that demonstrates the long road Brazilians have to obtaining equality for their women."
Even as laws improve, transformational change does not occur until the attitude of the society also shifts. The next step toward that shift occurred almost exactly 1 year after Franco's murder, when 2 retired police officers were arrested for their connection to the crime. By devoting resources toward solving her murder, the Brazilian justice system has shown the people that they acknowledge that the life of an outspoken Black lesbian matters. As attention is once again given to Marielle's tragic murder, Brazilian citizens will see the importance the government is placing on justice and the fight for equality. This example by Brazilian leaders will become a catalyst for considering the ways misogyny and homophobia permeate the Brazilian way of life, and will call into question how each Brazilian is affected by discrimination. In addition to being aware of the issues that women face in Brazil, we can also learn from these strong females and use them as inspiration to fight the inequalities in our own lives. Marielle and Maria both stood up for what they believed in and hoped that through their work, Brazil would change for the better. While Maria focused her efforts on making changes to the law, Marielle used her position to advocate for women's rights, LGBTQ rights, and to fight against police brutality. These women demonstrated that we need individuals from all walks of life to fight for equality in the ways they are best able to contribute. Everyone is capable of making a difference and pushing for change, regardless of where that change occurs.
On this one-year anniversary of Marielle's murder, let us draw from the courage of these two women and renew our conviction to advocate for equal rights everywhere, because we are truly one global community that must support and stand up for each other. Thank you. Joseph will now lead the Q&A.
Okay, great. So we just have a few minutes, so I'll lead off with the first question. And if anybody else has any questions, come to the right-hand side. There's a microphone, and then you'll come up and answer them here. So my question is something that I was wondering. It seems like Marielle's murder was kind of the last straw type thing, because you've mentioned like there were other murders. So what were some of the specific cultural or societal things surrounding her murder that made it so much more significant than maybe other murders that have been occurring with similar issues involved?
I think what really drew public attention to this particular murder was the brazen nature of it, the fact that she was an elected public official, the fact that it had all of the signs of being an assassination, a police assassination. And so that is really what garnered, I think, the initial attention in comparison to other tragic murders of other activists in Brazil. She's also from Rio, where there's a large media market. And so in comparison to maybe other cities in Brazil that don't have as big of a media market, I think that's another factor that called forth attention to it. And I think it also happened at a time, I mean, the Time's Up movement, I mean, was also present in Brazil. The Me Too movement is also present in Brazil. So these social action movements that have, spread across the world have also had counterpart activities in Brazil, like the No and No that I referred to, and so all of that happening in the last 2 years, and then in that context, this murder happening, I think that's what really pushed people to new levels of protest and activism that we hadn't seen previously. Any other questions?
Can I ask a question without going to the mic? What happened to Maria de Penha's children, who also seem to have been the victims of abuse?
Yeah, so the question is what happened to Maria de Penha's children. I'm not too familiar with their story, except that I know that she often appears with one or more of her daughters. And so, they're involved in that effort with her.
What advice would you give to us to help us become more involved in this movement?
The question is, what advice do I have for all of us to become more involved? I think that's a great question and a difficult one for each of us that we need to consider. what does it mean for us to stand up for the rights of others? What does it mean for us to speak out or to bring attention to places or moments of injustice? I can't answer that for you, but I think for me it has meant not shying away from talking about these issues with my students, trying to help my students understand that these issues are happening, that if we want to understand Brazil, this is a part of Brazil today. And so to understand Brazil, we need to address these issues. For me, it's also meant talking about these kinds of things at professional conferences and organizations with colleagues and helping to spread awareness. I think it's hard to fight or it's hard to resolve a problem that we don't understand fully, and so we need to study these issues so that we see them clearly, so that we can then understand how they can be resolved. Yeah. Great question. I can say it's meant different things to some of my other colleagues. For some of my colleagues, it has meant joining protest lines. It's meant signing petitions. It's meant writing letters. There are a lot of things that we can do. So if you're interested, I'd be happy to talk more about this after. Yeah.
Okay, so we're pretty much out of time. If you have any questions for Dr. Nielsen, feel free to come talk to him afterward. Don't forget to turn in your questions to Nick. And let's thank Dr. Nielsen one more time for coming out today.